Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our day after Christmas meeting of the Roundtable. And this particular meeting has been one of our longtime traditional meetings because instead of having a guest speaker, we have a lot of guest speakers because this is when you bring in the things you've come up with during the year that you might want to share with the group that might not justify a full-length talk of any kind. And it's been a lot of fun over the years because we've had everything from in the in-person meetings, we had sets of non-coin tokens from the Civil War and weapons and artwork and in one case a map that was borrowed from a museum by one of the board of directors of that museum to bring to the meeting. So there's been a lot of fun stuff that we've had at these meetings, and even doing it over Zoom, it's fun because there's an opportunity to sit comfortably in your home and share a story about whatever it is that you found. So, do we have someone who wants to kick off this evening's meeting? Betsy.
Well, I'm very excited to share. Last year, I wrote up part of the family history, and my great-great-grandfather said he was in Ford's Theater the night Lincoln was shot. And he wrote a letter when he was in his 80s about what happened. And I wanted to share that. It was in the summer of 1860, I got the notion in my head that I must enlist in the Army, but not being old enough, I could not without the consent of my parents. At this time, I was just 15 years old. On account of this, they would not have me enlisting. My mother told me that if I would think no more about being a substitute for a neighbor, she would ask father when he came home from Washington, where he was a government employee, to take me back and enlist me, which he did, and I was assigned to the 13th DC Militia. I was detailed as an orderly to Colonel Greason. Next to horses, the theater was his best bit, and we attended at least 4 performances a week. On the night of April 14th, we were in Ford's Theater in a box in the same tier as the one that President Lincoln was in, but in the second one from his box. We could see his party quite plainly. The play, a war play, being quite interesting, we were giving it our full attention. We heard a shot, but as we thought it was a part of the play, did not pay any attention to it for a second. And then someone in his party called out, "The president is shot." And at the same time, we saw J. Wilkes Booth jump, or rather fall, to the stage. But he was up and off immediately. If he spoke or used the words that he has been credited with, I did not hear them, and I was not more than 13 or 14 feet from him. Everything was in confusion in a minute. The colonel did not forget that camp would be a good place to be, and he ordered me to have the horses brought around, while he saw the ladies of our party to their carriage. We were the first to cross Long Bridge after the assassination, our camp being at Brisbane Point across the Potomac from the Navy Yard. I attended the funeral with the regiment. The war then being almost over, I was mustered out of service on the 21st of April, and on the 27th of April was my 16th birthday. So my family just loves that we have this story in our genealogy, and in fact, I took my grandkids to Ford's Theater last June, and we sat there and tried to figure out what all had happened.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it's also interesting that he says that they didn't hear Booth say the things that he's quoted as saying.
Yes, yes. I interpret that as being, when you're faced with something that witnesses just have different, when you're faced with a commotion. Yeah.
Interesting.
I think he mostly got the facts right, as I know, so I think it's probably true. But it's been carried on in the family all these years.
Were you able to figure out where that he may have been seated in the theater?
Well, yeah, because it's divided up into sections, and Lincoln was clear over on the edge. So if you're too sections over, then it was easy to figure out. There's like 5 or 6 rows of seats in that section. But
You'd have had to be in the balcony area though to be
Yeah.
able to be at the same level. Okay.
yeah, and as a tourist, you can go up in the balcony. So we were right there in the balcony looking
Yeah.
over.
I've been there several times in there for that, but I was just curious if you had like an idea based on, what he said about where you thought he was. So you feel he was off, if you're looking at the stage from the audience seating, that he was off on the right-hand side near where Lincoln was then?
Yes, yes,
It's terrific.
yeah,
Yeah. So he would have only been 15 at the time.
yes, yes.
Wow.
He was really young, and then he was mustered out at the age of 16.
That's terrific.
I love the way he says, our first thought was to get the ladies to their carriage. And then he wrote, we went back across Long Bridge. Well, I looked up the map. Long Bridge is a proper name. It's not just a long bridge. There was a bridge called Long Bridge.
Right, right.
Yeah, and in fact, it's still there.
So it appears then that he may have left prior to them moving Lincoln across the street,
Yes,
because he didn't account for that, and it sounds like that they left immediately when they realized that the president was shot, based on what
Yes.
you're saying.
yeah, there was there's that sentence that he says, the colonel did not forget that camp would be a good place to be. So I think they were thinking it could have been part of a bigger attack and they needed to get back to their regiment.
That makes sense, because if it was the DC militia, those were not very, very well trained soldiers. They were mostly just garrison troops.
Yes. And the fact that a very young boy could sort of safely serve in the militia, his mother got him into the militia so he wouldn't face any fighting. His father was in the Quartermaster Corps in Washington, D.C. at the time, so that's where that came from.
Cool.
And the father was one of 8 brothers, the Moore brothers, who all fought in the Civil War and on the Union side and all came back alive. And I've written up their histories and it's just fascinating. They were everywhere. Shiloh, Fort Donelson, Lookout Mountain, Virginia.
Well, it's lucky that you have all of that information for your family.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Betsy. All
You're
right.
welcome. Thank you for letting me share.
Now our long distance guest is here, Mr. Sarna. Would you like to share your information next?
Gladly. And many thanks for giving me this opportunity all the way from Central Arkansas to share my family story. But before I do that, I've got to do just a little bit of bragging. I belong to, and in fact, am the president of the Civil War Roundtable of Arkansas. We, in March, will be celebrating our 60th anniversary. So we've been going at this with our ups and downs for 60 years now, almost. And it's always a wonderful, wonderful thing to meet up with people, whether in Arkansas or anywhere else, who have this interest in this very, very important part of our nation's history and our nation's, if you will, heritage. Okay, just a touch of background material. The folks that I'm going to be talking about lived in the southwestern part of Arkansas. If you can go to a map of the state of Arkansas and look in the southwestern part of the state, look for a community called Camden. That's Camden, Camden. The story that I'm going to be telling you takes place about between 15 and 20 miles to the west-northwest of that town. And just a touch more, background, one of the people involved in this story is my great great grandfather, William Hilliard Rushing. William Rushing joined the Confederate forces in October of 1861 and soon wound up as an infantryman in the 15th Arkansas Regiment. The 15th was sent to Tennessee, and my great great grandfather's regiment was in the thick of the fighting at Fort Henry and, more importantly, Fort Donelson. And the 15th was one of the units that was surrendered at Fort Donelson. And my ancestor, along with all the others, were put into a prisoner of war camp until my great great grandfather's health broke. He was pretty old at the time. He was, by comparison to so many of the others in service, he was in his 50s at that time. His health broke, and following his exchange towards the end of 1862, was given a medical discharge, and he returned to his home in this area to the west-northwest of Camden. However, when trouble came their way, he immediately set out as a volunteer scout for the people in that area. What was the trouble? And who did he volunteer for or with? Well, truth be told, it all had to do with the Red River campaign in the early spring of 1864. The better known aspect, of course, is Nathaniel Banks pushing up the Red River through Alexandria, approaching Shreveport. Maybe not as well known is the fact that some 10 to 12,000 Union infantry and cavalry set out from Little Rock, Arkansas in March, in fairly early March. Excuse me if you see me kind of maneuvering around here. I've got a couple of rambunctious cats. They may try to get in on the procedure. So if you see me kind of moving around, that's the excuse. Okay, the soldiers set out from Little Rock about just a little bit before the middle of March, and were making their way down towards what is now the city of Texarkana, right on the line with Texas. They were going to, if all went according to plan, join up with Banks at Shreveport or a little ways north of the city. But just like what happened with Banks and his crew, General Frederick Steele and his forces also ran into very, very adverse conditions. That spring was very cold, quite wet, and the previous year had been a very, very bad one agriculturally. So the plans of the Union forces to live off the land went awry almost from the get-go. While Banks was facing the majority of the Confederate opposition, enough Confederates were detached up into Arkansas to slow Banks down and ultimately stop his march towards the Texas border. At a place just outside the modern-day city of Prescott, a place called Prairie du Chien, an artillery duel between Union and Confederate cannon stopped his advance altogether and reminded Steele that his men and his horses were running very short of food, of forage, of everything they needed to keep going. Steele concluded that the individuals facing him could be reinforced at almost any time. Rumors were reaching him about how badly things were going for Banks. So Steele decided that he was going to slip a little bit more towards the southeast, away from Prescott and towards the city of Camden, to see if they could find supplies, to see if they could destroy some Confederate installations, even some steamboats on the old Washita River. But when they got to Camden, they found almost nothing in the way of food, in the way of other supplies they needed. And we're talking about the 15th, the 16th now of April of 1864. Because things were in such a bad way in terms of food and forage, General Steele ordered a wagon train of just under 200 wagons to go out west, northwest, southwest of the city of Camden to find whatever they could for food, and sort of anticipating what Sherman would do in Georgia a little bit later on in the year, destroy as much of the supplies, the comforts, if you will, the resources, even the potential shelters that the Confederates and the civilians in the area would be able to use. The first day for the Union forces went fairly well. They were able to get out with their different groups, including elements of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, to go all over the area and find whatever they could: food, jewels, anything that they could seize, anything that they could take to deprive the Confederates of their use and to make, of course, things harder for the civilian population in the area. My great-great-grandfather.
No, turn it off.
I thought you were talking to me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm so sorry.
No problem. No, I'm just messing with your head. No. They sent them out on the 17th, and word leaked out from Camden of what the Union forces were going to do. My uncle was already in touch, or sorry, my great-great-grandfather, my apologies. I normally flub up like this on Mondays. My great-great-grandfather had already contacted elements of the Confederate infantry already operating in the area and volunteered as a scout. But in so doing, he had to leave his home. His wife, several sisters-in-law, and a couple of his children, including his only surviving son, who was almost 10 years old at the time, his son, William Milton Rushing, on the place. He had a pretty good idea that the damn Yankees were going to be returning right past where the Rushing home was located, and that did turn out to be the case. So, according to some versions of the family story, he told explicitly the remaining members of the family, what to do. In other versions, he told them some of what to do, but then left them to fill up the rest of the needs, or to respond to the needs as they saw fit. So comes the fateful morning, the fateful day of April the 18th, 1864. The Union forces continued their ravaging of the countryside, their seizing of whatever food, whatever they wanted to take, and they were starting to head back towards Camden. The Rushing home was one of the very last homes that this arm of the Union forces visited. According to the family stories, a captain was in charge of a fairly sizable detail that showed up with several wagons already loaded down with all sorts of loot, as well as members of various infantry groups. I do not know if the 1st Kansas Colored was among them. William Hilliard Rushing's family was ready as best as they could be. They knew already that the Union forces would take whatever food they could. They buried, not all, most of it. My great-great-grandfather had told them in no uncertain terms that if they hid all the food, that would only convince the Union forces that it was hidden, and they would have torn up the entire place. So they hid most of the food. There may have been some silver plate, there may have been some other valuables, they were hidden as well. The almost 10-year-old William Milton Rushing was ordered to take one or perhaps several cattle into a nearby ravine, cover their heads with blankets, tie them to trees to keep them quiet, while the Yankees were there. Well, the Yankee forces showed up. They quickly found what food was left, then announced that they were going to burn down the Rushing home. My great-great-grandmother and the other women begged and pleaded, don't burn down the house. But the captain had his orders, and the place is going to be torched. Well, then please, they implored, let us save the furniture. Let us take out our personal belongings. To which the captain responded, absolutely not. This is war, or words to that effect. Please, please then let us save some of our possessions. No, or words to that effect. The back and forth kept on going for a bit, and either worn down by their begging or just to try to make up for lost time, when my great-great-grandmother asked the Union captain if they could save just one item. The captain relented and said, yes, go ahead. And Ms. Janet Whaley, I am ready for you to show what they brought out. A Masonic apron. That is the apron that they brought out. It's been not sure whether my great-great-grandfather specifically told them to save that apron, or if it was just something they just did on the spur of the moment. But that's what they brought out. The captain noticed it, asked them to unfold it. His eyes widened. He just froze in place for a second, then turned to his command and said, men, get mounted. We are not going to burn this house. In one of those incredible coincidences, the captain was a Mason. And one Mason cannot knowingly do harm to another Mason. The Rushing home was virtually the only home that was not destroyed, because the Union forces could not do much more after they left the Rushing home. For only about a mile down the road, Union forces were ready and waiting for them at a place called Poison Springs. You have this fight at Poison Springs, with the 1st Kansas Colored, of course, making up part of the Union ranks. And you have some Choctaw Indians from the Indian Nation as part of the Confederate ranks. So this is one of the few fights in the Civil War where you, honest to goodness, have white, black, and red participants. Poison Springs turned out to be a very definite Union defeat. When the firing broke out, the almost 10-year-old William Milton Rushing heard what was going on defying what his mother's warnings were, don't go down, you'll get hurt. He took off. He obviously was going to do the equivalent of seeing the elephant. When he got back, all he would say for the rest of his life, and he lived until about 1929, is that he saw wild hogs rooting among the dead bodies. He could not, he would not ever talk about anything else, which leads me to very strongly suspect he saw some of the atrocities, the after surrender murder of members of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. But the Masonic apron saved one of my ancestors' homes from being destroyed. The apron was passed down through the various generations until the 1980s, when my last surviving uncle got it. He and his daughter wanted to do the right thing, so they turned it over to the Historic Arkansas Museum in Little Rock for restoration and preservation. But while it is there today, I have the very, very great pleasure of knowing and of telling the story about the apron that saved a house. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you, Mr. Sarna.
See, your cats wanted to participate in that. I was hoping there was going to be a cat connection, that you were going to tell how the cats were related to the particular story, that Stephanie, when she's in Zoom sessions, that the cats always want to participate with her as well for that. But
well, hold on a second. One of them in particular was making the rounds, and I get it naturally. That is the branch of the family that even during the Civil War had a love affair and had several cats on the premises. So I get that from them.
so there is a connection.
See what I mean?
Yep.
See what I mean?
Yeah, you got a couple of great looking cats there.
Yeah, and I'm proud to say all of them are rescues.
Oh, terrific.
All right. Well, so who do we have who wants to go next with a story to tell us tonight? Mr. Barron, and then Mr. Shuttleworth. Okay, Mr. Shuttleworth, why don't you go ahead while we're waiting for him to rearrange himself?
Okay. I'm not sure how. I know how to. I see my picture up there, but I don't know how. Do I just hit screen share? Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
I got it. Okay. Well, last year I shared about my great grandfather, and this is him here in this picture. His name was Philo Sandifer. His wife was Susan Rebecca Sandifer, and they lived in Henderson, Kentucky in about 1860. And he had joined the Confederate Army in about 1862. And I guess he got wounded and came home. And near the end of the war, the Union forces were in command of the city. And I think they were going to try him for, being a rebel. But I don't think that happened because it was right near the very end. It was in February of 1865, and his neighbors and friends wrote a letter. So I don't think it ever happened, but I'm not sure. But anyway, this year, I want to share about my great-grandmother's half-brother, who was kind of an infamous fellow. That's him there. His name was John Marion Jarrett, and he was married to Cole Younger's sister, Josephine, whose picture's there. I got that one off the internet, so it's not too good. This is a picture of Cole Younger, who was a partner of Jesse James. But anyway, Cole Younger and my, I guess he'd be a grand uncle, were brother-in-laws, and they joined the Confederate Army at the outbreak of the Civil War, and John Marion Jarrett was at least was a member of, I think, Shelby's unit at first, but then he later joined Quantrell's unit along with Cole Younger here, and became a Missouri ruffian, I guess is what you'd call him. That's a picture of him there. I don't know if you noticed, but he's got 3 pistols. Kind of an ugly guy too, I guess. But anyway, he had a horse shot out from underneath him in Lawrence, Kansas on that raid, and Cole Younger rescued him. But between the two of them, they had stolen $80,000 out of the bank, and they ran off. But anyway, he became an outlaw and a bank robber, and this is a few of the things about him. First of all, he was a Missouri ruffian and brother-in-law to Cole Younger. He'd been a Confederate soldier, I believe it, like I say, in Shelby's unit, but he later became a member of Quantrell's unit and was on the Lawrence raid. Became a bank robber after the Civil War was over, and was part of the Jesse James gang. The things I've read about it says that at one time, he may have been the leader of that gang before Jesse James became the leader. But anyway, I guess things were getting kind of hot for him in Missouri after the Civil War when he was an outlaw. And so he moved around, first went to Louisiana, and then left and went to California. He ended up going from California to British Columbia in Canada, and that's where he died in 1906. I believe that he had a couple of daughters and a son, and I don't know what happened to the son, but the daughters, I believe, kind of disowned him because they went to see him when he was dying, but they didn't go to his funeral. So I don't know, and they were in British Columbia too. But I did find where he had gone to Henderson, Kentucky, which is where my great grandmother lived, and they had one of their daughters there. And so my suspicion, and I can't prove this, but my suspicion is that he went there because of his half sister being there to help with having the daughter, but I don't know that for sure. I found this out through a distant cousin who lives in Henderson, Kentucky right now, and is a professional genealogist. And she found this information about this guy here, and the fact that he was a half brother to our common. I don't know. I guess she's a great grandmother of this lady in Henderson, Kentucky right now. But anyway, she found it out and told me about it. And so at the time, I told her, I said, well, my dad said there was some connection to Jesse James, and I figured it was just family lore, not very accurate, because my father didn't know very much about his own genealogy. And she told me, she said, well, we heard the same thing in our family. And my grandfather's name was Jesse. His first name was Jesse. So, and my dad used to tell me that he was named after Jesse James, but I don't know that for sure. Anyway, that's all I've got to share.
Janet, you had your hand up.
Go ahead and share my screen and hope I can get it right. I'm going to talk a little bit about an opportunity that I had this year. I was contacted by Savas Beatty Publishing. Ted Savas, who many of you know, um, contacted me and said that he had an author under contract who is writing a comprehensive history of the Battle of Chancellorsville. He resided on the East Coast and he needed someone in proximity to the Huntington Library who would be willing to handle the research for this East Coast author. So research is a loaded word. It sounded a lot more grandiose than it actually turned out to be. What he really needed was someone to photograph the documents in the Joseph Hooker collection at the Huntington Library. So we set out to do that. First, I had to get credentials, and Savas Beatty helped me by doing that, indicating that the Huntington was the only location that had this particular collection, and that the author needed to have access to that collection. And so we began the work. The Huntington is a very strict research library, as you can imagine. They have very strict rules and procedures for using their reading room. The file boxes have to be pre-requested. You cannot bring your own writing tools into the library. They have a stack of pencils and paper for you to use, and you're checked in and assigned a table for your research. So here's the project. The photograph, the contents of 5 boxes of documents, a total of over 3,000 images. And the time spent on it was over 23 hours just doing the photographs, and another 15 hours sorting, editing, and filing the images in Dropbox files that the author could then access and manipulate. So there were some interesting discoveries that were a part of this project. So I thought I'd share those with you. There were some very famous signatures in the documents in these folders. And the first one was Winfield Scott, Commanding General of the U.S. Army. George Gordon Meade, Major General of the 5th Corps. Thomas Francis Maher, Brigadier General of the famous Irish Brigade. John F. Reynolds, who was killed on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Oliver O. Howard, and do you think that this guy might have been a lefty? He Major General of the 11th Corps. Winfield Scott Hancock, Major General of the 2nd Corps. George Armstrong Custer, when he wasn't a general, but was an aide-de-camp to Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Pleasanton. And our own hometown hero who retired to San Marino, George Stoneman, the Major General of Cavalry. But what famous signature is missing from these papers? Well, Major General Joseph Hooker, commander of the Battle of Chancellorsville, did not seem to sign any documents. Most of the documents were written on his behalf and signed by his chief of staff, Daniel Butterfield. So that's another famous Civil War personage. Daniel Butterfield's signature was all over these papers. Other interesting discoveries. The people in the Civil War armies used and reused whatever paper supplies were available. And that included old envelopes. There's an example of that. A date book sheet from 1862 that was later attached in 1863 to a piece of signal telegraph stationery, perhaps so it wouldn't get lost or misplaced or misdiagnosed or mislabeled as a 1863 document. They used all available space for writing in one direction and then turning the paper over and writing the other direction. And that to me just seemed impossible to read, but I guess they could do that. They also had interesting methods of fastening pages of multiple documents. They had what would appear to our eyes to be similar to an ACO fastener, a metal fastener, to put those pieces together, as well as fastening metal grommet holes in the top part of the document. They also used steel pins on very delicate pieces of tissue paper. And then they had ribbons that were attached to hold the papers together. And then they had just good old-fashioned string. there were different embossing stamps, and I have talked with the author who's doing this project. He has no idea what the embossing stamps signified, why they were different for different types of stationery. He's contacted the National Archives to find out if they know what the embossing stamps were for, and we just don't have an answer for that right now, but I found that to be quite interesting. Uh, but they had a small printing industry that was needed for all the various types of stationery in this campaign. You've got different departments, headquarters, corps, cavalry corps, uh, headquarters offices, for the telegraph department. All of these were printed forms that were available to the troops, as well as the one for General Hooker. They had the use of perforated forms, which I found fascinating, that they were not quite punched through, but could be perforated. And they also had a method for repairing torn documents. Now, I don't know that this was post-war or during the time that the documents were done, but it appeared to be cased and pieces of paper to hold that document together. And you see various degrees of penmanship in these documents. Most common was the average use of a dip pen, where it's quite blunt and firm. And then you have writing in a much finer hand that I have no idea how they were able to do that with a dip pen, but it is quite striking. They had very finely detailed maps as part of this collection, which appear to be, again, in a very fine point of ink. And I don't know what kind of tools they were able to use to do that. And then they had a very detailed level of reporting. For example, the estimate of public animals, wagons, etc., required to complete pontoon trains. And you have all of this detail both across and downward on that form, as well as the report of property lost and abandoned by the troops. And again, very fine, detailed accounting. You wonder how they had the chance to fight a war when they were this disciplined about their detail in their reporting. There were certain pieces of history that struck out. Obviously, we all know that Lincoln had a telegraph office in the War Department that he spent a lot of time at, and he wanted to be kept abreast of everything. So here you have the transcription of a telegram from Lincoln asking, where is General Hooker, where is Sedgwick, and where is Stoneman? He wanted to know where people were when he wanted to know it. Excuse me. There is a pride in these generals where they didn't like unfounded rumors being cast aspersions upon their person. So Major General Howard reported back to General Williams, and this is May 10th after the battle, that it had been reported that his front was not properly picketed, but the allegation is not true. My pickets were beyond my front line and located by my own aide-de-camp. So he wanted to on record what he had done in regard to the pickets during the battle. And then you have a message, excuse me, a message from Major Butterfield saying the rebel message was intercepted and that the Yankees have fallen back to Aquia Plain. Hooker's headquarters are at White House and not much shipping at Aquia. I'm sorry. Signed by A.P. Hill. This was an intercepted message that the Union Signal Department was able to see the Confederates signaling this message to their troops, but that their flag was partially concealed and they weren't able to get the address of the message, but that was the substance of it. There's even the information about Stonewall Jackson's wounding, that they informed me the whole rebel force where it was near the heights of Fredericksburg that Stonewall Jackson lost his arm Sunday night. So the very we can actually touch on that piece of history and when things like that were communicated to the Union Army by a scout for General Slocum. And then very tellingly, the very last piece I wanted to share with you was the request for the burial detail. I don't believe that this was written by General Hooker. I think this was probably written by one of his aides, because all of the writing in it is similar. But he would most respectfully request the privilege of sending a burial party on the field of Chancellorsville to bury the dead and care for the wounded officers and soldiers of my command. So here you have the final transmission indicating the results of the Battle of Chancellorsville and how all of them had to still handle burial details at the end of these battles. So I want to thank you for that. It was an interesting opportunity for me to be able to do this project. And I can't tell you that I made millions on it. There was absolutely no paycheck involved, but it gave me the opportunity to enter the storied halls of the Huntington Library and to see these pieces of history, and to actually be able to touch these documents was really something special. Stephanie was asking what brand of, quite fine equipment I use to make these images. They are all taken with my iPhone. And thankfully, Apple has developed very good photographic equipment and allows very clear photos. There is not any special lighting in the library reading room. There are tables with a table lamp, and I simply put the documents to be photographed under the lamp so that it would have some lighting from above, and they were just strictly iPhone photos. Any other questions? Mr. Barron says that the library has relaxed their requirements. I don't know how strict they were beforehand. Maybe you'll be able to tell us when you talk about your thing. But the library did not request copies of any of the photographs that I took.
They used to be incredibly strict about getting in there to do that kind of research. They required written stuff from, like if you were doing it for an organization or an academic, they required written stuff from that organization.
Well, I think that's where the letter from Savis Beatty probably helped crack that.
Yes.
I can help you with this. I'm a veteran now of the Huntington. And maybe I'll see you over there if you're back at in the Rosenberg or the rare book room.
No, I didn't make it to the rare book room. I think it was the Amundsen reading room.
Yeah, no, that's the rare. That's it. That's the rare book room.
Okay.
And on Tuesdays they're open only to the scholars, so that's the day to go.
Okay.
They're open till 7. Yeah.
Except tomorrow it is open to the public on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
Right. Oh, this was Tuesday.
Today is Tuesday. Yeah, it was open today and
Yeah.
next Tuesday.
Well, I think today I think the library was
Closed.
closed because of the holiday today.
Until January 3rd.
Yeah.
Huntington's always closed on Tuesday. I know under the new president, they purposely
But I
wanted
have
to
an
let
email
their
from-
collections
And I'm
to a
gonna,
wider audience. So if you're researching, I went into research just family genealogy, and they purposely wanted to have more people be able to use their resources. So,
Good.
yeah.
I can keep it brief, but I'm happy that we're Zooming. I live out in the boonies, and it's difficult for me to get over to the meeting in person. Again, I'm an amateur Civil War historian. I don't know. You guys probably know way more than I do, but I've been spending the last 11 years working on a project related to my family, and also interested for writing this book. So the picture here of this interesting building is the Barron, spelled the same way as me, Barron Art Center in Woodbridge, New Jersey, which was John Connor Barron's hometown. And his rich uncle Thomas Barron, my namesake, donated a significant amount of money in the late 1800s to have this building built initially as a lending library in Woodbridge. They were going to tear it down and put a gas station there. Instead, it was put in the historic registry, and the township took it over and turned it into an art center. And they have a little bit of a stipend from the county or the township to run it, and there's a small staff and the rest. And in 2019, the township celebrated their 350th anniversary, and they had what they called the Barren Fest. Everything's barren. There's a barren. The high school mascot is a barren. There's a barren avenue. There's a barren cemetery. There's barrens everywhere. And they invited me to bring my book, which they heard about, to present at this 350th anniversary, which basically gave me a deadline for this project that I'd been noodling away on for years. And that which is the preface for this image here. This is the book. It's an 8.5 by 11 self-published tome. I don't know how many of you have gone through this whole drama of self-publishing, but basically I'm a designer slash cinematographer, jack of all trades, and I got pretty good with the program InDesign. And so I designed the book and also wrote it at the same time, which is I don't recommend if you can avoid it. But the essence of the book was a memoir that my great-grandfather had penned, and my parents had gotten from a relative, taken it to the neighborhood drugstore, made a crappy wet copy of it. My dad transcribed it into an Apple computer and eventually lost the original copy of the memoir. So I was working from his transcription, and my original plan was to just make a little booklet that I could send on to the library. This was back in about 2012. And it turns out that my sister took a trip to India, and while she was on the trip to India, the woman next to her said, "Hey, by the way, you're a baron, right?" And she said, "Yes." "Well, do you have a relative who was a surgeon in the American Civil War?" And my sister said, "Why, I do." And she says, "Why do you ask?" She says, "Well, I have letters from him to his uncle that in my collection." And my sister's like, "What do you mean? What do you mean your collection?" "Oh, I'm a Civil War hobbyist, and I'm a doctor, and I've always been interested in Civil War memorabilia, and I have these letters." So my sister's mind was blown. So I'm the idea that this unknown stranger would have a family object. So now, can you see this screen here? Am I showing a letter? Let me see if I can see if that's.
Yes, the Dear Uncle letter.
Yeah, Dear Uncle. Okay, so on the left is the original letter. On the right is her transcription. When my sister came back from India, she called me up and said, "Hey, Thomas, this pamphlet you're working on, I've got this woman that has these letters." And I'm like, "Oh my goodness." Well, she didn't have her email, and that was a problem. So then eventually we found her. We had a family reunion. We invited her to come over. She forgot the letters. So now this is like kind of dragging on, and I finally get in touch with her, and she sends me these beautiful scans of the letters, transcriptions, as well as plenty of background information on what was in the letters. And I realized how little I knew about the Civil War. So at that point, I conned a couple of author friends of mine into getting me credentials to go to the Huntington. And I started researching in the Rothenberg at the Huntington into the 69th New York State Militia and my great-grandfather. Well, it turns out that the great-grandfather was assigned to this Irish regiment. Although of Irish ancestry long before, was not one of these characters in the 69th. Well, it turns out the 69th was, first of all, here's a picture. This is the from my book. These are scans from my book. But here is an illustration, a carte de visite of my great grandfather that was shot by I don't know, is that a bigger, better picture? Shot by his brother-in-law, C.D. Fredericks, prior to his going off to the 69th. And he, as a surgeon, was an officer, obviously, in the crew. The rest of the 69th was full of these Irish patriots. And there's a very famous photo, which I'm hoping I'm showing, shot by Matthew Brady of the regiment, at the militia, the New York State Militia, at the Fort Corcoran, which was the first fort that was built on the other side of the Potomac, and they put this big naval siege gun there. They all posed around it, and this particular picture, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, is everywhere. I mean, Ken Burns used it. It's in books. It's, there's 100 versions of it. And and I figured, well, my great grandfather's got to be in there because he's one of the officers. So I contacted the Library of Congress. They didn't know anything. I contacted the National Archives. They didn't know anything. I contacted the Irish American scholars no one had any information, but at the same time I started piecing things together and came up with an identification. There were some obvious people, like the man on the left is Michael Corcoran, who's a very famous character. The guy leaning on the cannon is Thomas Marr, who someone mentioned earlier. And so these guys were all really badass Fenians, and my great grandfather was, mixed in with them very unpredictably. And along the way, I got familiar with. There's a whole group of scholars on the Battle of Bull Run, and there's a guy named Harry Smeltzer, who you may have bumped into, who runs a blog for the last 12 years or more, or longer. Here's a picture of him here, Harry. And he and John Hennessy and the rest of the guys in Manassas, they give tours, but he's been publishing letters and he's been running this blog forever. So I got in touch with Harry, and he didn't know anything, but was very interested in the photo. So in the process of getting ready for this event, I got together with the woman that had the letters, and we took apart this photo of my great grandfather, and we started looking at things like his the fabric on his sleeve, and his medical insignia, and ultimately pieced together what we considered to be an authentication of the various members of the crew, including my great grandfather. So at the Huntington, or at the Barron Library, this is an overview. This is the interior of the Barron Library, with our exhibit up for the 350th anniversary. So these are all like poster boards and tears from my book and family memorabilia and all the rest of it. And I'll spare you the pictures of the crowd and the video and all that stuff. But basically, this was a nice exhibit. And as part of the exhibit, I put the Brady photo up, had it enlarged. It's a glass plate, and I got a really good scan from the Library of Congress. And which, by the way, has been retouched and scratched. And I mean, there's 2 or 3 versions of it. At any rate, this is a very good print of it. And then I made a little ID down in the corner of who the members were, the famous members, and then I had my book on display here, and sold a few to my relatives, and so at this point, I was like, okay, so the project, we made the presentation, I made these wonderful boards, we were big heroes, everything was fine. I had spent endless hours at the Huntington, got to be friends with lots of other people, wrote a second book while I was at the Huntington, and, kind of put things to bed. And suddenly I get an email from my friend Harry saying, "Hey, I just got something you'd be interested in." And he showed me this picture, which is a scan of a scrapbook collected by an illustrator named James E. Taylor. And Taylor was one of those sketch artists that would be sent out instead of a photographer to do pen and ink or charcoal sketches on the battlefield, and then they would send them back to the magazine, Frank Leslie's magazine, where they would be turned into lithographs and printed and sold and whatnot. So Taylor's a famous guy, and he had this scrapbook, and in his scrapbook is this picture of Brady's crew, the crew by Brady, and drum roll please, there's my great-grandfather in the foreground, identified as I had expected based on this elbow. And so now 11 years after I had tried to figure out and identify him, I got an official certification of that with this important scrapbook. Great. So I contact Harry. I said, "Well, where did this picture come from?" He says, "Well, I got it from my scholar friend in Ireland who is researching the Irish in the Civil War, and he ran across this picture on his digital internet searching, and he, spotted Barron, and he sent it on." I said, "Really? Where's the original photo of this from?" "Well, you'll never guess. The Huntington Library." I've been sitting right next to this damn thing for 11 years, right? Okay, and now it wasn't the most important thing, but it does certify that my great-grandfather was part of the team there. And it turns out that the real hang-up was that, well, first of all, Taylor's a very famous guy. This scrapbook is a precious item in the Huntington that they bought in 1919. And it's part of a digital photo record, which is independently cataloged from the print, the library down the research library in the basement, and independently from the letters and documents that Janet pulled up. So it was my fault in not really knowing, how to navigate the Huntington. But punchline is that it was very satisfying to get the answer, and to feel like I wasn't a complete idiot as far as identifying this person, number one, and number two, that it was a good yarn as far as my relationship with the Huntington, which, like I say, it's been many years now, and maybe I'll do another edition of my book and put the story in there. So there you go.
Well, thank you.
And incidentally, on this Huntington, just to be clear on the Huntington, so pre-pandemic, it was really hard to get in. As Janet said, you had to be especially in the documents. At one point, they segregated. I was a rare book reader as opposed to a manuscript reader, and so that meant I had a different cred, and I could wander around in the stacks and I could handle ancient books, but in terms of pulling documents, that was a whole different world. They've relaxed all of those requirements, but at the same time, after the COVID, there are very few people actually in the library. It's amazing. On Tuesdays, which is the Huntington itself is closed, except that the staff works there, and the library is open to researchers from early morning until 7 at night. And it formerly used to be a kind of a hangout where a lot of scholars would get together in the afternoon and have coffee and swap lies about all the work they're doing. But basically now it's kind of vacant, which is a little off-putting. On the other hand, you're welcome to Well, first of all, you apply to get your little card, and then they give you the rules about, not marking up the books or post-it notes and all that stuff. You don't use gloves, number one, but the Civil War collection is quite extensive, and it's in the basement of the Rothenberg, and you can wander around down there, and just look at these amazing. I mean, some of the books are current, and pretty recent in the last decade or two, and a lot of the books are from the period, but they're all available to be grabbed and looked at. And one of the things that I did initially was I was crawling around on the floor looking at stuff, and I bumped into a book on Karl Marx on the Civil War, and I'm like, Karl Marx on the Civil War? Say what? And then I realized that not only was he contemporary, but he was also Dana's foreign correspondent, and he was being slow paid when he was writing Das Kapital and starving to death in the British Library. It was because he was being slow paid by the New York papers. But at any rate, it's a wonderful place, and I would recommend it if you're in the Pasadena zone there, that you just, get your tag and go wander around down there and pull the books off the shelves and blow the dust off them. It's just great.
And we had a question from one of the people.
Yeah.
Victor asked if the Huntington is putting their collections online. It's my understanding that they're gradually putting their photographic collections online, but not the text collection.
Right. Yeah, this is where my James Taylor picture came from. It came out of their digital photo archive, and that comes out of a different department. Yeah, it's a little awkward. I mean, what I would do a lot of times is I would find a book that was interesting, and then I would go on archive.org, and I would hopefully find a facsimile of it on there, and then I would order it from ABE Books, and it would arrive, a month later, and it would go onto this groaning shelf I have of Civil War books. But as far as digital, they don't have there is a book scanner there that you can put you can take a book back in the back and scan it. And as far as the rights and use of the materials from the Huntington, they're pretty liberal with that. You do have to give them full credit. And as far as the photo, what Janet was saying about the rephotography, initially when I started, that was really tough. I mean, you had to schedule this. You couldn't bring a certain kind of camera, and you had to go to a specific spot to do it, and all the rest. Well, they relaxed that, and with the new iPhones, after going through hundreds and I don't know, tens of thousands of images off the internet, I ended up illustrating my book almost exclusively with scans of the Frank Leslie newspapers that they have in full scale. I mean, there's wonderful in shooting the pictures with the iPhone. The quality was quite good. And but anyway, as far as getting stuff online, no. Sometimes you can ask for a specific document. If you contact them, sometimes they'll make something available to you. But anyway, it's a good place.
Well, thank you. So, did we have any other volunteers to share a story for tonight?
Yeah, I've got one here, Nick.
Great.
So, in fact, I've got a connection with what we were just talking about there with the Huntington Library. It's sort of a tie-in with that as well. Here we go. For those of you that may or may not know, that my wife, Stephanie, is actually an author with the Civil War News, and she writes a monthly article for them. I do the illustrations for the colorizations and the restoration for the images that she covers. So she has her article is entitled "The Through the Lens," which focuses on different aspects of the Civil War and highlighted by a particular photograph that we'll use to be able to represent the area in there for that. In fact, the connection that we have here with the Huntington Library is that she actually that unfortunately it was just at the start of COVID. We went to attend an event there in February of 2020. She applied to be able to get her credentials with the Huntington, and because of her work with the Civil War News, they granted them rather quickly. But then they ended up closing down the research area because of COVID, and then we ended up moving. And long story short is that she was not able to use that. However, that's not the story that I wanted to be able to share. What I wanted to be able to share was that this year they asked for an updated photograph of their columnists in there for that. So I was trying to find something that we had in the area that was related to the Civil War. If we could find something that was Civil War related, we'd take Stephanie there, we'd take a photograph of her and record that there. So what we found was that there is a Civil War cemetery in San Luis Obispo, and that here it is. And you'll notice here that there is an item that is right here that turns out to be a cannon from the USS Kearsarge. The USS Kearsarge, for those of you that are not familiar, was a Civil War ship that was famous for having won the battle with the CSS Alabama in the Battle of Cherbourg in France. So I actually pulled some images from that. So if we look at that over here, here we go. There is the USS Kearsarge in there for that. And then here is information about the battle that took place there. And there were some photographs here. And that one of the things that was interesting was that when we were looking for a Civil War item in there for that, we found the Civil War cemetery, and it said there is a cannon, a 32-pounder, that is on display in the Civil War section of the cemetery that is from the USS Kearsarge, that is there, and it is the Big Bill is the name of the cannon there. And so you can go there and you can take a look at it. It's like terrific. We'll take Stephanie there. We'll have a photograph of her standing by in front of or near this particular cannon in there for that. And I was expecting a cannon of somewhat of this size to be able to do that. Here's some other images from the ship in there for that. Images of just some different ones in there for that. And so we said, terrific, we'll go out there and we'll take a look at that. Well, here is Stephanie in front of the cannon in there for that. It turns out that in order for her to be able to be portrayed next to the cannon in there for that, the cannon is much smaller than you would expect, and it's only about 3 feet tall. So she actually has to crouch down here in order to be able to fit into the photograph. So we took several different ones in there for that to be able to do that. So it looks a bit bigger than it is, but it is actually pretty small in comparison. As I mentioned, I was expecting something that was going to be fairly substantial coming off of the ship, but it's actually fairly small. And you can see in the back here, there are the Civil War ones that are upright, and then they also have a number of them here in the ground in there for that. But anyway, I just wanted to be able to share that, just something, just a little bit of a bit of difference there. You find sometimes that there is a Civil War connection right in your own area, and you didn't even realize it. So just wanted to be able to share that.
And Janet had a question about how it got to San Luis Obispo. I will say that from my own research, the GAR posts often asked for things that were technically surplus and got them, because the Kearsarge was not going to remain in service forever, and an 1860s 32-pounder was not going to be much used by the 1880s or so. So it was probably declared surplus as a weapon. And at that point, the GAR posts got dibs on stuff like that, because there are a number of them in California from different places, land cannons or shipboard cannons at some of the cemeteries and some of the different historical sites in California. There was one in Long Beach. I don't know if it's still there because there was a problem with where they installed it. But there were several around from different military posts where once they were declared surplus, it's like, sure, you move it, you can have it.
Yeah, this particular one, the ship was actually in service for quite a long time. It actually was not decommissioned until the 1890s, so it was in and out of service in there for that. And that we did actually find some notes on there for that, so I'll just read a little bit about what the notes say on there for that. So the gun served as the focal point for the Memorial Day celebrations in San Luis Obispo from 1892 until 1927, when the cemetery opened, and then it was moved over into the cemetery in there for that, and then was and with the passing of the last of the Civil War veterans, in there for that. The canon became neglected, and it was moved to the plot where it is basically now to be able to do that. So that's where it is in there for that, and a little bit about how that it got there. Said that the United States Navy donated it to Fred Steele Post number 70 in there for that in San Luis Obispo, and it was kept as a monument to the veterans in the area for that. So just a little bit of a local thing here for that. I was very happy to be able to find something that was in half an hour drive of the house where we can go out there and to be able to spend a little bit of time to be able to do that. But anyway, just a little something to share.
Sure. Well, thank you. So do we have any other stories for this evening?
I'll go quickly. Hello,
Sure.
everybody. My name is Zach. I am a member of the Pasadena Civil War Roundtable, and I also have a channel on YouTube called the Civil War Wild West Edition, where we focus on the war between the states and territories as events happened, specifically in the Southwest and the West Coast. So we just passed the Christmas holiday, and some of y'all may have been, stressed out just with the logistical burden of having to go around all these places and buy these gifts for friends and family, just as tokens of your friendship and affection. And sometimes to overcome that type of stress, you need to buy some Christmas presents for yourself in order to validate the whole experience. So that's exactly what I did. I went and bought some Christmas presents for myself after my shopping for everybody else was done. So I've got a lovely little stack here of books that deal with the Civil War, specifically in the Southwest, and some of these focus on California or Californians. So this first one I picked up at the gift shop at the Drum Barracks when I went to the Christmas shindig that was at the Drum Barracks, and it was a lot of fun. This book is called The Beat of the Drum, and it is a history of Camp Drum during the Civil War. And Camp Drum is in Wilmington, which is a district in southern Los Angeles. And it was also the base, the headquarters for the Union Army's Pacific Department of Southern California. It's also the base that was HQ from which was launched the invasion depends on which side of the war you agree with. But the operation in which the Union Army, comprised mostly of volunteer soldiers from California, took Arizona and New Mexico back from the Confederate Army. And I would like to share a quick letter. Just a note, Camp Drum, this big Union Army base, was named after Richard Drum, who was a captain at the beginning of the war, and he was a brigadier general by the end of the war. And a lot of high-ranking military officers or politicians who were loyal to the Union would get military bases named after them, and that practice continued on the West Coast. So this base was named after Colonel Drum, General Drum. However, I would like to share the contents of a letter that I found, which was absolutely fascinating. This is a letter from Captain John Davidson, who was a captain in the 1st U.S. Cavalry, so he was a federal regular. And this is addressed to Captain Richard Drum, who was at Camp Fitzgerald in September of 1861. Now, Camp Fitzgerald was a temporary Union Army camp that was in downtown Los Angeles. The modern-day location would be between 2nd and 3rd Street. And this letter from Captain Davidson says, Captain, the information given you in my letter of the 9th has received much corroboration within the last few days. Judge Terry is said to be at the head of the Secesh organization. Secret nightly meetings are reported to me to be held by armed men at the Monte, 12 miles from Los Angeles. When he says the Monte, he's talking about the city of El Monte. With regard to the last I've sent out and will continue to do so until something most positive is learned by me, nightly patrols of intelligent non-commissioned officers and 1 or 2 men for the purpose of ascertaining where and by whom these meetings are held and, if possible, their object. Now, he mentioned that Judge Terry is the head of the secessionist organization at El Monte. Judge Terry is Judge David Terry, who was the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court until 1859, when he resigned shortly before a duel that he knew was probably going to kill his career. And in this duel, the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, David Terry, shot and killed David Broderick, who was California's U.S. Senator. Broderick was a Northern Democrat and Terry was a Southern Democrat. And it's really interesting that Captain Davidson has identified Judge Terry as the head of the secessionist organization in El Monte. Mind you, this was in September of 1861. So Richard Drum is still a captain, and Camp Drum does not exist yet. It hasn't been established. 2 years later, Judge Terry will end up in Texas. He will join his brother's regiment, the 8th Texas Cavalry Regiment, Terry's Texas Rangers. And then the following year, Judge Terry will get command of the troops in West Texas, including the remnants of the Arizona Brigade. So the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Texas Arizona, who were serving in different places, one of which was in Arkansas for a short time and did serve fight in the Battle of Poison Springs. And that is some absolutely fascinating information. And the two main hotspots for secessionist activity in Southern California were El Monte and San Bernardino. There was a lot of activity in town at the beginning of the war, but as the Union Army moved men to counter the secessionist threat and basically help keep Southern California in the Union, the secessionists took their operations and their schemings up into the San Bernardino Mountains, up to the point of there were a couple of hundred guys who were regularly doing militia training for the Confederate Reverse Underground Railroad, wherein citizens of California were leaving California through the southern part in order to escape to Texas and join the Confederate Army. Now, this was the Reader's Digest version that I gave you, but in my upcoming presentation to you guys next month, I'm going to cite some interesting sources, including the Civil War in Apache Land, which is the diary of Sergeant George Hand of the 1st California Infantry. So he writes from Los Angeles, he writes from Arizona, he writes from New Mexico, and he writes from Texas. Another interesting book that I found is called Hell with the Fire Out, and it is about the Modoc War, which was in Northern California in 1872. You can barely see some Modoc tribesmen photographed here. One of the reasons I'm interested in the Modoc War, other than it happened inside of California, is this is the war in which General Richard Canby, who was the Union hero of New Mexico, he helped kick the Confederates back to Texas. That's the war where he was killed. And then the last book that I got that I want to show you guys, which is so cool. This was actually a Christmas present from another human being to me, so it wasn't entirely my ego operating here. This is California Sabres, and it's about the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry. Now, between 15 and 17,000 men from California joined the Union Army. I like to go with the figure for 17,000 because 15,000 would account for the California volunteers. The other 2,000 would account for the Californians who joined the volunteer regiments of other states and territories. So the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry, while it did have a lot of Massachusetts natives in that unit, it was more than 50% volunteers from California who were either on the East Coast in 1861 for whatever reason, they had left California, or they left California and then they took a boat and then they took a 30-mile train or stagecoach ride across Panama and then took another boat to get to the East Coast. And these men from California were in the Shenandoah Valley Campaign in 1864, and they were in it all the way to the Siege of Petersburg. So these were California guys who were not on some frontier duty, out in the boondocks, primarily fighting Native Americans and occasionally arresting secessionists. These California men in the Massachusetts Cavalry actually fought in some of the most intense battles of the war. So that concludes my sharing for this evening, and I definitely look forward to sharing a lot more information with you folks next month and probably sucking all the oxygen out of the room in the process, but hopefully you'll bear with me. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Does our Vice President Ed have a story to share with us tonight? It wouldn't be the same without you, Ed.
Well, I will share one thing, and it comes from what David was saying earlier about the Kearsarge. One of the things that's kind of fascinated me for a very long time has been the naming of naval ships. We are going to have another aircraft carrier fairly soon called USS Enterprise, which I think will be at least the sixth, probably more like the eighth U.S. Navy ship named Enterprise. And so Kearsarge is often the Navy will find a hero ship of days gone by and will rename subsequent Navy ships after that one. And indeed, the Kearsarge has had several different iterations in the Navy. There was a battleship of the Great White Fleet back in the days of Teddy Roosevelt. There was a World War II aircraft carrier named Kearsarge. And today there is an amphibious assault ship with the name USS Kearsarge. So that kind of went along with something that's already been said tonight. And yeah, this has been fun.
Before we wrap up, because I think we've gone through all the people who'd said they had stuff, I have one really quick thing to share because you will find Civil War history in the strangest places. Almost 65 years ago, the Kingston Trio had a hit with a folk song, their version of a song called Tom Dooley. How many of you know that Tom Dooley was based on a real murder case? And how many of you know that that murder case involved not one, but 4 Civil War veterans? And that's the tricky bit. Tom Dooley, which was spelled D-U-L-A, it was pronounced Dooley because in North Carolina they do that, was charged with murder, and the case was defended by the former commanding officer of, now here's where it gets complicated. Tom Dooley's ex-girlfriend had married another man who went off to be in the 26th North Carolina under Zebulon Vance. Zebulon Vance was the defense attorney at the trial for Tom Dooley and that man's and his subordinate's wife, who was Tom Dooley's ex-girlfriend. There was a 4th Civil War veteran involved, though. If you remember the song, "Hadn't it been for Grayson, I'd have been in Tennessee." Well, Colonel Grayson was a Unionist in East Tennessee. Tom Dooley, in trying to escape from the law, had to get money to get a new pair of boots because he hadn't really been prepared to make an escape. And the man there, Colonel Grayson, recognized the description of the man who described himself by name as Tom Hall. And that's what led to his capture in Tennessee to be returned for trial. What makes it interesting, though, is why is Colonel Grayson's name even mentioned in the song when it's really all about the murder trial in North Carolina? That's because the song is from the family story the Grayson family carried on. And the nephew of Colonel Grayson was the first recording artist to record a version of what became the Ballad of Tom Dooley. In the 1920s, Grayson and Witter were a popular act singing Southern folk songs. The Grayson there who recorded it was a blind fiddler who was the nephew of Colonel Grayson from the story. The younger Witter, the blind fiddler, died in one of the most embarrassing and slightly funny traffic accidents of all time, because as a blind fiddler, he was riding on the sideboard of a 1920s vehicle, which got into an accident, and he was the fatality because he was riding on the sideboard without being able to see. Personally, I don't think it would be a good idea to ride a sideboard blind, but what the heck. Anyway, I ended up researching things about the song, and sometime I will tell a longer version of it because there's a lot more to the story, and it is both legally stunning and quite bizarre because Zebulon Vance took the case and it took 2 years to resolve what you heard in a 3-minute song from the Kingston Trio.
And the Kingston Trio actually has a Southern California connection as well. They're
quite
actually
a
out
few.
of Coronado.
They had quite a few Southern California connections. I actually met the last surviving member of the Kingston Trio a few years ago. It was really cool. But one of their biggest concerts ever was actually here in the Los Angeles area at a place, I think in Santa Monica. Anyway, so I want to thank you all for showing up for this evening's meeting. And on the 4th Tuesday of January, we'll be back to meeting in person at the Blinn House. And for those of you who can't make it to the in-person meeting, we'll still be putting up the video for later on YouTube. So do you have any things other than to wish everyone a happy holiday season for what's left of it, and warn you if you're going to the Rose Parade, it'll be slightly wet for the day before. All right, Janet?
Thank you, David, very much for being our host tonight, and thank
Of
you all for
course.
coming.
Well, good night to you all, and see you in January.
Hey, well, Happy New Year.
Yes,
Thanks to everybody.
good night.